everyone, and welcome to Annie and Melina's podcast. We're going to discuss the Oseberg burial that was found in Oseberg, Norway. We are also going to discuss the Viking burial traditions and Viking ships. Anya, can you start by discussing a little bit about the excavation site?
Of course, Melina. The ship at the burial site was found buried under peat that was on top of blue clay subsoil. That mix of soil was essential to preserving the wood that was used to build the ship and other objects that were in the ship. So the reason that the peat and the blue clay subsoil was really important to preserving the ship is because peat is very absorbent, and the blue clay soil is also very, very absorbent. Viking ships were super important to the Vikings, and to prove that, I'm going to quote Mark Nuttall when he says, "The greatest technological achievement of the Viking period was in ship construction. Although sailing ships were used in the 8th century, it was not until the 9th century that large ocean-going sailing ships became relatively common." Do you have anything to say about the Norse funerals?
Yes, I do. Ship burials are very interesting when it comes to the Vikings. Typically in Norse culture, which is the Viking culture, the funeral rituals would be very distinct. In early times, due to the pagan beliefs, for typical people in the Viking culture, their bodies would be cremated, then buried, or their ashes could be scattered, but these rituals would include putting the deceased on their boat, filling it with goods and sacrifices, and then setting it out to sea in flames. This can be demonstrated in the following quote from The Archaeology of Death and Burial. "The closest relative to the dead man then took a piece of wood, lit it, and, completely naked, walked backwards towards the boat, facing the crowd, holding the stick in one hand, using his other hand to cover his arm. The people each took a piece of tinder or firewood for him to light, which he then placed in the wood pile beneath the ship. The flames grew and engulfed the pyre and the ship. We burned him in a moment, so then he could enter paradise all at once." This quote depicts a story in which a Norse funeral is being set up and how the man is being cremated on the ship. The Vikings cremated the deceased because they believed that the smoke that arose from the cremated would help them to reach their rightful destination in the afterlife.
And Melina, why was the Oseberg ship an important discovery?
The Oseberg ship burial was a very important discovery for archaeologists, historians, and even to us when understanding the Vikings. In this burial, 2 bodies were found. When analyzed by scientists, both bodies were determined to be female. The identity of the 2 Oseberg women still remains a mystery. What scientists do know is that one of the women was about 50 years old, and her teeth indicated that she had been eating food of a very high quality. She also had a collarbone that was broken, but her cause of death was still very unknown. The second woman was between 70 and 80 years old. This, at the time, was very unusual because of her age. Hardly anybody lived to be that old. Scientists have discovered that she had several health problems, which included arthritis and compression injuries in her spine, which would have made her walk crookedly. She also had a cancer that had spread to her bones. But with her was found a small leather bag full of cannabis seeds, which could have been used as a pain reliever. And they also discovered many other objects that were included in the burial of the 2 women. This can also be demonstrated in a quote from the Museum of Cultural History. The quote starts by saying, "The Oseberg ship was pulled ashore and used as a burial ship for the 2 women. A burial chamber was constructed immediately behind the ship's mast. Inside, the walls were decorated with a fantastic woven tapestry, and the dead women were laid on a bed made up of bed linen. The women had a number of burial gifts with them, such as clothes, shoes, combs, a cart, 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 small cows. From this quote, you can tell that these women came from wealthy backgrounds. You can also tell that they took the burials very seriously. By sacrificing all these animals instead of using them for their purposes, proves that they are doing the necessary things in order to ensure their acceptance into the afterlife. Many Vikings would have had their slaves buried with them. As archaeologists had discovered that there were many other bodies in the burials with the Vikings, they also had noticed that many of these bodies had been decapitated or had hands or feet that had been tied. During the Viking Age, after raids, many Vikings often took slaves as their booty. They did this because while the Vikings weren't raiding, they were often farmers. These Viking farmers would have to rely on the slaves for agricultural work. Therefore, when scientists have discovered this, they assumed that these decapitated bodies were those of slaves that had been sacrificed and buried with their masters to serve them. Also, as scientists analyzed the DNA of these bodies, they had discovered that these bodies were not in fact related to each other. Therefore, they decided to analyze the ratio of carbon-nitrogen isotopes in the bones of these bodies. By doing this, they could identify the diets of each of the individuals based on the chemicals that were in the food that was ingested. These results had shown that the beheaded people ate more fish protein, whereas the land-based protein sources such as meat and dairy products were eaten by the bodies that were not decapitated. Therefore, you can conclude that these bodies or these people had come from different statuses in society based on the cost of the dietary foods that had been ingested by each of these individuals. Therefore, you can conclude that these beheaded victims were slaves who were sacrificed as gifts to be offered in the death on behalf of their masters, and this was not an uncommon practice in Viking society. It was very popular to include human sacrifices within these burials. Also found with the women in the Oseberg burial were 3 highly decorated sleds. They were decorated with various animal forms and geometrical patterns. These would have been carved out of wood. Also used to decorate the sleds were iron, brass, and silver. Another artifact that was found with the women was a cart. The cart was made out of oak and also was decorated with carvings. This cart would have been drawn by 2 horses, one on each side.
Melina, could you tell us a little bit about the Viking burials?
Yes. During the age of the Vikings, there was a shift from the Norse funerals to inhumation funerals. Inhumation funerals consist of burying the deceased in a grave that has been dug out of the ground. They can often have a gravestone above in order to identify the dead. This shift occurred due to the change in religions that were practiced by the Vikings. At the beginning of the Viking Age, Vikings mainly were pagan and practiced pagan traditions. But because Charlemagne had changed the Holy Roman Empire's official religion to Christianity, this meant that pagans were now forced to convert to Christianity. During the Viking Age, trading was very active. Therefore, the pagan Viking would have to trade with these new Christians. Christian traders tended to give more business and better deals to other Christians, discriminating against the pagans and the Muslims at the time. In order to try to avoid this problem when trading, a Viking might wear a cross when he was with Christians, only to change it back to the usual Thor's hammer when he returned home. As long as the Viking trader wasn't baptized, he could practice both religions, which at the time was a common practice in Scandinavia for the next couple centuries. And eventually, over the centuries, the amount of pagan Vikings slowly diminished to change to be Christian. Anya, I would like to know how we know that the ship is from 834 AD.
Well, the date was found through dendrochronological analysis. Dendrochronological analysis is basically analyzing wood from the grave chamber. They analyzed the grave chamber because it was most likely built for the grave, meaning it was most likely made at the same time as the burial. Dendrochronology is better known as tree ring dating. The experts look at the tree ring's width to determine a date. The dendrochronological analysis is also used to see how the environment has changed over the years. This technique is thanks to many people, most importantly including Theophrastus, who is Greek, and he is one of the first people to state that trees have rings, and Leonardo da Vinci, who said that trees grow a ring every year and that the width or the size of the ring is based on the environmental conditions. Inhumation burials are really interesting, Melina. Can you elaborate on that?
Of course. Inhumation funeral practices used by the Vikings usually included burying the deceased in a grave. This can also include placing the deceased on a means of transportation, such as a wagon, a cart, or even a boat. This item would then be buried along with the body. The grave can also have the deceased's personal belongings, pets, or even servants, such as in the quote provided from the Encyclopedia of the Arctic. It starts by saying, "The pagan elite were generally cremated and placed in burial mounds, stone rings, cairns, or stones aligned in the shape of a ship. Impressive mounds can be found at Bor in Norway and Jelling in Denmark. Norwegian ship burials include the large ships at Oseberg, built around 820, and the slightly later Gokstad and Thun ships." This quote describes the burials of pagan religious practicing people. These burials were referred to as ship burials because what they incorporated into the burials were the deceased's ships. This means that the bodies were buried with their own personal ships. For example, the Oseberg ship has been included in this. The Oseberg ship burial is the burial that we have chosen to focus all of our attention on. So, Anya, can we talk a little bit more about the excavation process?
Definitely. The excavation lasted around 7 months. It went from June 13th to December 16th, 1904. Everything was studied on the site of the burial. There were zoologists, archaeologists, geologists, and botanists.
So, Anya, that means that there must be an interesting fact or something interesting that you can tell us about this.
Yeah, there's a really interesting technique that was used to build Viking ships that is called the clinker technique.
Whoa, what's the clinker technique?
Well, the clinker technique is done in many steps. The first step to the clinker technique is to build keels. A central one for the front of the boat, and one for the back of the boat. The keels had to be long and straight. However, it kind of has a V shape to it. The V shape was essential so that the keel can be joined with the hull. Afterwards, at fore and after the boat, that means at the front and the back of the boat in boat lingo, 2 pieces of wood called the stem and the stern are placed and attached to the level with tree nails. The next step is building the hull. The hull is built of strakes, and the first one is attached to the keel with iron rivets. The strakes are joined together until they join the stem and stern. To make sure the boat is as close to watertight as possible, the Vikings had a technique called caulking. It involved animal hair dipped in pine resin that would be painted onto the ship. Finally, the frame is put into the ship. The frame is important because it transmits the force from the oars to the hull.
So, Anya, when the boat was found, what state was it in?
The Viking ship that was found in the Oseberg burial is between 21.6 to 24.2 meters long. The beam is 5.1 meters. The sides of the ship have a height of 1.6 to 2.1 meters. The ship itself is thought to be a multifunctional ship.
But what's a multifunctional ship?
A multifunctional ship is a type of longship, which I will discuss a little bit more about later. It's a ship that can be used for cargo and war.
So, you mean to tell us that there's more than one type of Viking ship?
Of course! There were small boats, which were used for daily things such as communication, fishing, bringing people from place to place, and so on. There were also warships, which are also called longships, and there are 3 different kinds of longships. Their names are Sneke, Drekar, and Skide. The ships are generally around 30 meters long and are shallow and narrow. They are rowboats and were built to carry about 30 rowers. They were rowboats because rowing allowed a lot of speed and maneuverability. We know that they were rowboats because on the ship there were 30 oar holes and 1 steering oar. There was also an iron anchor and a tool to empty the water off the ship called a bailer. These ships were used when attacking the monasteries and villages during the Viking expansion. Finally, there are cargo ships. There are 2 types of cargo ships, heavy and light cargo ships. Both ships were deep and wide to carry the cargo. They were mainly sailboats, so they were not very fast. The heavy ships were built to carry a maximum of 40 tons of goods. The light boats carried less cargo and were light so that the merchants could pull them and be navigated through rivers. Speaking of Viking ships, there was a collective effort in 2010 to attempt a second reconstruction of the Oseberg ship because the first time they tried back in 2004 was unsuccessful. The new Oseberg was a success, however. It hit the open seas and reached the same speed as the original Oseberg ship would have hit, which was a speed of 10 knots. The original ship is now at the Viking Ship Museum in Norway. To give a summary of what I learned that Viking ships were essential to the Vikings. They needed them for war and for everyday things. Also, there was more than one type of Viking ship, and for the most part, they are all built with the clinker technique.
To conclude, these Viking burial ships are very, very important to learn about. They are important to learn about to understand our past, our present, what led us to where we're at in society, and also to understand the future, what we can prevent or what we can encourage in our future. Therefore, the work of archaeologists, historians, etc., is never really over.